Hello and welcome to this conversation with Ukraine's Finance Minister Sergii Marchenko. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and it's really my pleasure to be able to host the Minister on his first trip to Washington in the post-COVID era, if we can call it that. Mr. Minister, welcome to SIPA. It's so great to see you and to meet you for the first time. You have been Ukraine's Minister of Finance during a very tumultuous time in the world, a tumultuous time for Ukraine as well. Since you joined about 15 months ago, you were appointed by the President in March 2020, right as COVID was taking grip of the entire globe, and you've done a fantastic job managing all of these crises. I've been following very, very closely what you've been doing on the reform agenda as well, and we'll get into all of that in this conversation, but just want to welcome you again and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
So I think maybe we can start with what is probably on the top of everyone's minds that's following the U.S. Ukraine relationship, which is, of course, the upcoming expected visit of President Zelenskyy to the White House. We don't have an exact date for the visit. We know it will probably, hopefully, happen sometime in the next few weeks this summer. But I'm curious to hear, what do you expect to be the key priorities from Ukraine's perspective for President Zelenskyy's meeting with President Biden?
Thank you very much for this question. You know, for our country and for the President of Ukraine, it's a very important visit because it shows our great desire to improve and to strengthen our relationship with the United States. And we have several priorities in mind. First of all, is strengthen our political relations because we believe that the United States previously supported Ukraine and now it supports us in different areas, especially dealing with Russia, dealing in European community. Another question is our, army war relations, because we see some necessity to receive additional support to combat our eastern enemies. So that's why the support of the United States is very important in this matter as well. Maybe the third and the most important area is economic. It's important for me as a Minister of Finance. It's area of economic and finance. I believe we can manage to fulfill all our commitments on IMF program and to be able to proceed with it, to receive support from the United States directly. We had a meeting this week with Under Secretary or Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasuries, Volodymyr, and we discussed the possibility to receive U.S. guarantee on our loans. It is possible, but it's a question of our ability to proceed with the IMF program and the policy of the United States towards this instrument. Another question is infrastructure investments towards Ukrainian roads and other critical infrastructure, because we eager to receive investments in Ukraine, and we had a strong desire to show that our country could be a reliable partner, to show that we are able to get investment and to show that an investor in Ukraine can able to receive profit and get back the investment as well. So this is maybe the key priority. Among other, it could be some relations in social sphere or some educational. So it's more concrete. But I expect this visit could be very breathtaking, I believe, for all countries. Let's see. Let's fingers crossed that it happens. So we'll see how.
Absolutely. From my perspective, from SEPA's perspective, we're very much looking forward to seeing the outcomes of this important bilateral discussion here in Washington. Very happy to see the White House invite President Zelenskyy to D.C. It will be an important meeting. President Biden just had a series of key meetings in Europe, including obviously the meeting with Russia's president, and of course having coordination collaboration with Ukraine is very, very key whenever we're talking about the potential for changes in U.S.-Russia policy. Russia remains an aggressor against Ukraine, occupies large parts of Ukraine's territory, and I think until that changes, which I hope it will, obviously, we need to ensure that there's a close and strong relationship between the United States and Ukraine. But let me follow up on something that you already started speaking to, which is very much in your portfolio on the finance side, and has been one of the key subjects of your discussions here in Washington, as you said, which is Ukraine's progress on reforms and the broader IMF package. Just a few weeks ago, Ukraine's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, passed a package of really key anti-corruption and judicial independence reforms. In its steps towards fulfilling its IMF obligations. The tranche payment from the IMF has been on hold for a short amount of time. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more from you on where do you see Ukraine's progress on the IMF agenda? What is the status of current reforms, specifically anti-corruption reforms in some key sectors like energy, and the judiciary as well?
It's a good question. Now we have very good negotiations this week in DC, especially with the head of European department, the IMF mission team as well. We discussed all issues which are now in our agenda. We discussed our progress, because I believe so. We've got very good progress this year. You mentioned judicial reform. We already passed through the parliament necessary amendments to our legislation, and next week it's also great expectations that we will finally vote on one law which opens the room for judicial reform. And it's our commitments, and President Zelenskyy and government committed to fulfill it until the middle of this month even. And among, except of judicial reform, I would mention also progress on gas market installment. We already have a market in our retail market, and we don't have any government intrusion in this particular market. Still discussion about electricity market, but it's like a discussion how to calibrate existing system. Also, great progress we achieved in a fiscal sphere. We had better results this year and previous year than it was previously expected. Last year we had preliminary deficit 7.5% of GDP, but factual one we received 5.2. This year,
that was for 2020?
For 2020, it's in budget stipulated 5.5% of GDP. We perceive it will be lower because for a half year budget execution we have only 1% of GDP as a deficit. So the key reason of that is our good tax collection. Our revenue surplus is exceeded $1 billion. So that's why we are able to make our future more clear. I mean, because in September we expected some part of debt repayment, big part. We should repay our euro bond, we should repay US guaranteed debt. So we are trying to collect necessary amount of currency to do so. I'm happy to tell you that in fiscal part everything is settled, and we have no further discussion on that. Maybe other matters of discussions, independence of National Bank of Ukraine, but it's still we passed through the parliament also necessary amendments to our banking law that could strengthen the power and independence of National Bank of Ukraine. So for this part, everything is quite good. So the key issue is anti-corruption legislation, because of previously made decision of our constitutional court, which make some damage in our anti-corruption infrastructure, and for the half a year we are trying to find a way how to fix it. I just name it on that. But this is a main and key question on which may be stubborn our negotiation. But I believe we will find a way how to move further, even with anti-corruption.
I think one of the interesting laws, which is slightly outside your perhaps direct portfolio, that the Verkhovna Rada, Ukraine's parliament, endorsed is what's been colloquially called this anti-oligarchization law, which I think has signified huge progress in Ukraine in its desire, the government's desire, and the president's desire to really push back against vested power interests. Can you talk a little bit about that and the support for that? And that's something that's been on the agenda in Ukraine for such a long time, but it has never quite become a reality, I think, until we saw these recent reforms being passed. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about the commitment to that particular anti-corruption reform from your perspective.
I think it's also one of the key reforms which are not under any program. So it was the incentive from the presidency by themselves. So he eager to make some splits between people who had money, some influence on media, and to be politician. So the idea is to make some red lines. If you have big business, you should operate it. You shouldn't be in a parliament, you should operate it. If you have media plus business, it just should be prohibited. It should be, you shouldn't influence politicians. You know, I envision very tough discussion on that matter, because a lot of people frightened that we are trying to clean our parliament from some opposition. I don't think so. It's a question of how we will implement other important laws, because these laws make some frame for this discussion. It's not just clear rules on how we can manage to implement it, to fulfill it. So now it's a question, after that law we should elaborate other legislation which make it reliable and doable.
Absolutely. Thank you for speaking on that. I wanted to keep with this, the financial thing that we're discussing today, and I think it's interesting to note that the current ambassador, Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, also has a finance background, was your predecessor at the ministry as well. So clearly this is a top agenda for the presidential administration to ensure U.S. support, not just in terms of defense, but also U.S. support in terms of ensuring that Ukraine continues to grow and prosper from an economic perspective. And I think some of the conversations you've had, I hope they sounded promising to you, and I hope that some of those efforts will move forward. But one of the key political issues that continues to be quite divisive here in the United States is Nord Stream 2. And the U.S. administration just a few months ago was criticized quite heavily for issuing waivers on the Nord Stream 2 holding company, the AG, as well as its president, who is a German citizen, but has a very questionable reputation, if I can put it that way. And now that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline looks like it will be completed, that likely will come into operation quite soon, this continues to be a huge problem for Ukraine's national security. And one of the topics that I was hoping to hear from you is if Nord Stream 2 becomes operational, that is still an if, how will that affect Ukraine from a financial perspective?
Nord Stream 2 is a problem, but it's not problem which appear just this year or maybe last year. It's a problem which we have known before, and it's a question that our reaction was to make some sanction on people who are involved, business who are involved, and thanks United States, we did a great job together. But now it's a time to recalibrate our current disposition to understand if it will be just start operating, what we should do, what will be our reaction. For us it's important to get on one thing. We want to have gas in our pipe. Yeah. That's why we believe that we can manage to negotiate with Russia after the finishing this contract, another contract. We believe so because I think that European customers could back us on that particular question, and because we have also consumption in Ukraine. We now consume we bought gas from outside of Russia, not Russian gas, but anyway, it's a question that we should be able to operate our gas transmission operator. And if you ask me about cost, if it will not be that type, I don't believe it could be so, but anyway, annual profit of our gas operator is more than $1 billion. Also, it's a lot of people are involved in this company, so it will be very damageable for our economy. But I don't perceive it could be like a very dramatic situation, because for me it's clear that we should find a way how to deal with Russia, with consumers in the European community, to be able to provide them a very open, very reliable source of transmission. Only after that we could be able to save this pipe, because it's not a question of pipe, it's a question of, you mentioned security. Yes, it's a question of our national security. So let's see how things proceed, because I'm not so deep involved into this question. I just mentioned some facts about how it can influence budgeting, how it can influence our economy as a Minister of Finance. But maybe we have some more deep strategy. I don't involve it.
Well, I think certainly if and when there's a reduction in Russian transit of gas through Ukraine, there has to be a plan for filling in the loss of that revenue, and whether that comes from negotiations, you said, with European partners and allies. Of course, it'd be very valuable to have the United States involved in that negotiation process. I think Ukraine has achieved a huge amount by no longer exporting gas, importing gas directly from Russia, but not through reverse flows, and that's been a huge achievement, which again speaks to Ukraine's greater national security from an energy perspective. And I think now the question is about security from a financial perspective as Russia moves further and further towards fulfilling the Nord Stream 2 project. But let me just move on for a moment here. I know you don't have a lot of time with us, so I wanted to close our conversation unless there was something else you really wanted to talk about, and ask you one specific question, which is, I've learned that you are an avid triathlon competitor and athlete, and so I have to ask you, what is harder, training for a triathlon or being Minister of Finance of Ukraine?
You know, before I became the Minister of Finance, I believe that to be like half an Ironman, it's very strong, and only people who are really tough and perceived in their goals should be ready for that. Now I am changed my mind to be the Minister of Finance of Ukraine in this particular moment of time in COVID, when there is a crisis, when you have some necessity to cut your spending in a budget, etc. It was tough, and I believe that this is my real Ironman, and this is my real triathlon, because I can manage to train, but to be the Minister of Finance, you should be trained harder and harder every day.
Well, I think that I will take your word for that. Not being a Minister of Finance myself or a triathlon athlete, but I believe you there, of course. And just let me say again that you definitely took over this role. I know it wasn't your first time serving in the Ministry of Finance. You've served there for quite a few times already, but certainly leading the entire financial institution of Ukraine during incredibly difficult times over the last 15 months. What you've been able to achieve in establishing fiscal stability, budgeting stability, as well as moving forward on the reform agenda has been very impressive. And so thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
It was really a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me too.
Thank you.
Thank you.